The Hudson Library and Historical Society's Adult Program Series presents a special historical novel about one of the most pivotal months in the history of the United States of America. Author and noted attorney James Robenalt speaking about his new book, January 1973, Watergate, Roe v. Wade, Vietnam, and the month that changed America forever. Recorded at Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on November 11, 2015.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming out. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight. I'm excited about this program. He did a little preview before everyone came in, and I got a little taste of it, and I think you're in store for something really wonderful. I have been putting this event in lots of different places all over the area, and Cool Cleveland, a website, picked it up and publicized this is a cool event to come to. So you should be excited for tonight. I'm pleased to introduce James D. Robenalt. He's a trial lawyer who has written several books on the American presidency, including Linking Rings, William W. Durbin, and the Magic and Mystery of America, and the Harding Affair. He, along with his lecture partner, John W. Dean, is a sought-after speaker on the Watergate scandal. Mr. Robenalt will also be speaking at the City Club in Cleveland on November 18th about this book. So please welcome Mr. Robenalt.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this on and see if you can all hear me. Okay, how's that? Great. Polly, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I love this particular historical society. I've spoken here a couple different times. My very first book was about my mother's grandfather who came to the Western Reserve back in the 1840s. He was a physician, a doctor who came from Maryland originally. And in writing that book, I found that he wrote a letter to the governor of Virginia, a guy named Henry Wise, in November of 1859, asking for clemency for a guy named John Brown. And he was asking for clemency because he said he had known him for 10 years in this area, the Western Reserve, where he had traveled around on horseback as a physician, and that he thought he was crazy, and that his family was crazy. And so he wrote this. I've never read this. I've read a lot about John Brown because I'm fascinated with the story. Of course, you know that his papers are here, and this is a wonderful place for that reason. But I'd never seen my great-grandfather's letter referenced. So I had found it in the National Archives, or the Library of Congress, which is, if you go to the Capitol, behind it there's a place called the Madison Building where the Library of Congress reading room is, where you can go in and read some of this stuff. And I found a card that referenced this. And I tried, the guy said, go get this microfilm and go to this page. And I went to the page, I couldn't read it. And I took it to him and I said, I can't read this. And he said, just a minute, walks back, comes out with one of those, archival boxes, opens it up, and on top of it is my great-grandfather's letter. And it's on blue stationery, written in pencil. So that's why nobody ever picked it up. They're all looking at the microfilms, they couldn't read it. And to my knowledge, he's the only physician. He was a doctor and a surgeon who ever opined on Brown's sanity. So it's kind of an interesting letter, and that's why I love this place and love the history around this. And let me just spend 2 minutes telling you how I got to this current book from that story. So I wrote the story of my great-grandfather called Linking Rings. This guy was born, this is my great-grandfather, the son of the doctor, was born right after the Civil War. And his dad was already then a very old man and died as a young man, so he had to kind of take care of his mother and his brothers and sisters. Do you all know where Kenton, Ohio is, over near Marion? Tiny little town. He grows up there. He becomes very interested in magic as a kid and starts to do his own magic stuff. And ultimately, he will start an organization called the International Brotherhood of Magicians, which today is still the largest organization of magicians in the world. And when I was researching the book, David Copperfield asked me to come out to Las Vegas to look at all the files he had on my great-grandfather, from him starting what they called the IBM. He knew Houdini and Blackstone and all these guys. They were his contemporaries. And but his love of magic didn't equal his love of politics. And he got involved in democratic politics as a young man in this little town, was sent to Washington and during the Grover Cleveland administration, went to law school, came back, and then became the chair of the Democratic Party in Ohio for many, many years. Ran William Jennings Bryan's campaign and then Woodrow Wilson's campaign, and when he died, he was the Register of the Treasury for Franklin Roosevelt. He was a real New Dealer, and he died when he was in office in 1937. He was the second in command at the Treasury Department. So what an interesting guy to come out of Little Kenton, Ohio. That was my first book. It was about the magic and mystery of America is what I wrote about. And that then allowed me, that came out in 2004. In 2004, Dick Cheney and John Edwards debated here in Cleveland at a case. They called it the Racek case. And it was a terrible debate. I don't know if you remember that debate or not. It was awful. But Case asked me to do a symposium on Ohio and the presidency. We've had 8 presidents. And so I looked up who had written the most recent book about one of our presidents, Warren Harding, the last of the Ohio presidents. Sure enough, it was John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel. And the reason was Arthur Schlesinger Jr. asked Dean to write the book because Dean grew up in Marion, which is where Harding is from. So he wrote this book, and it's another look at Warren Harding, and he's been badly treated by history. But in the midst of that, I went to the Western Reserve Historical Society and said, do you have anything of interest that John Dean, because I knew he was coming, on Warren Harding would be interested in? And the guy on the phone literally says to me, I can't tell you over the phone, you gotta come out and see me. I thought, really? I can't tell you over the phone. And he knew I was a lawyer, and so I went out, he took me, the archivist, into the back room. Have any of you done any of the research in that beautiful library they have at the Western Reserve? It's a really cool place. Took me in the back room, shuts the door. He didn't close the drapes, but I felt like he did. Puts a box up on the table and takes out a microfilm. He said, do you know who Carrie Phillips is? I said, I think that is one of Warren Harding's mistresses. He said, yes, and these are the love letters that he wrote to her. I said, really? I thought those were under seal. I'd read enough at that point to know that. There was a lawsuit and they were put under seal at the Library of Congress for 50 years. And I said, how did you get that? Well, one of the guys involved in the dispute gave his papers to the Western Reserve, thinking nobody would ever see this microfilm, and the guy finds it, doesn't know what to do with it. So we went into one of the microfilms and we started scrolling through it, and the first thing you see is a photograph of Warren Harding in 1910, and on the back of the photograph, you scroll further, is a love note that he had written to this woman on Christmas Eve, 1910. And it begins, Carrie, my darling, there are no words to describe my love for you. And it goes on from there. And you're like, woo, this is something. Turns out there are 900 pages in this collection. These are letters that he sent to her from the period of their relationship started in 1905, ended when he became president in 1920. So it's this was no Monica Lewinsky. 15-year relationship. And so I wrote that's my second book, The Harding Affair, about that. And I was actually going to speak about that tonight because this is Armistice Day, and very interesting connection to this book in the sense that Carrie Phillips became a German spy during the First World War. And Harding ends up finding out about it. And the only reason she wasn't arrested and tried was because of the armistice, that the war ended so quickly after we got into it. We really were not in the First World War all that long. And so she didn't get arrested. It all kind of got buried, but these letters clearly show she was being followed by then the Bureau of Investigation as a spy. And I mean, it's a fascinating story. That's my second book. I'll come back and speak about that at some time. So that then leads to me doing programs with John Dean about Watergate, and we go around speaking to lawyers about ethics he's kind of the ultimate in-house lawyer working for the worst CEO in the world, Richard Nixon. It's all on tape. How many people saw John testify? Yeah, so we know your age. It's fascinating, because he was taped and he did it goes into warn Nixon, there's a cancer growing on your presidency. He was 34 years old when he did that. Imagine, 34 years old. And so we talk about it, we use it as a lesson for lawyers about what do you do when you find out your client's involved in crime or fraud. And we've done like 125 of these programs around the country. We do a lot of speaking together, and I've gotten to know him very well. That's where this book comes from. So during the time that we were preparing this, we had to walk through January 73, because if you remember the dates, Watergate is June of 72. That's when they're caught. And then January 73 is when they go on trial, the burglars who were caught. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then John breaks rank in April of 1973 and then testifies in front of the Senate in June of 73. So it all happens quickly, but as we were walking through this month, I said, John, look at this, all of this stuff happening at once. There are a ton of things that happen in this month. And so I've never done this when I've talked about a book, but I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs here. This is how I start this book. Walk among a stand of quaking aspen trees. That's why I've got that up there. On a sunny, breezy day, and you will experience a sublime, surpassing sensation. The trees are alive with activity, silvery leaves glinting, twisting and trembling, whistling a soft melody, sounding like a voice of the beyond. What you may not know is that all the trees you see are one organism, identical in DNA, carbon copies of one another. That's because aspens grow in colonies from a single seedling that spreads through its roots. New stems, known as root suckers or ramets, pop up from the dirt at distances from the parent tree, creating a new tree, and then another, and then another. The entire clonal colony is interconnected below the surface through a single root system. The individual trees may come and go, but the root system remains, sometimes living for thousands of years. Studying American history is much like an examination of aspen trees. The connections are not obvious unless one digs. And then it becomes clear that everything is mysteriously linked. So that's how I start this book, because these stories that make up January 73 are interconnected. And tonight I'm going to really focus on Roe v. Wade, that part of the story, but I'll tell you just an idea of how interconnected these stories are. You all know this photograph. This is the day Kennedy's assassinated. Jackie is brought on Air Force One. It's extremely hot. They're waiting to take off. Johnson insisted that she get on the plane with him. And he called the woman in front of him who's swearing him in, because he knew her, from Dallas. Her name was Sarah Hughes. She's a federal district court judge in Dallas at the time. She has the distinction, because of this event, of being the only woman to ever swear in a president. Sarah Hughes, 8 years after this photograph is taken, decided a case called Roe versus Wade. Wade was the guy who was the district attorney in Dallas at the time of the assassination, who brings Oswald out in those late night things. That's Roe v. Wade. That's where it gets its name. Her decision, a 3-judge panel, will be appealed directly to the Supreme Court. It will not go through a court of appeals. We'll talk a little law today, but I promise it won't be too much. But it goes directly to the Supreme Court. And on January 22, 1973, the culmination of this book, Roe v. Wade is decided by the Supreme Court, affirmed her decision, and Lyndon Johnson 3 hours later drops dead in Texas. So it's all this interconnection, and I'm looking at it all, and that's not the half of what is in the book of how these events are interconnected. So what are the events? This is the name of the book, that's the cover. Truman dies. He dies the day after Christmas, 1972, but his memorial will be in the National Cathedral on January 5, and that's a big part of the initial story. The war in Vietnam will end for the United States in this month. Again, on that same day, January 22, before Rose announced, Henry Kissinger gets on a plane to fly back to Paris to initial the peace accords that he had been working on all those years. A week later, the Watergate burglars go on trial, and this is Judge Sirica. So I tell the story of that trial, which is an amazing story where this judge becomes more prosecutor than judge. And it's an amazing story. 2 days before that, Roe v. Wade and Johnson dying, Nixon delivers his second inaugural. It's a game changer of an inaugural, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But it's very important, and of course, I've got all the tapes to listen to. He stays up the night before this, after going to the inaugural events, and calls Chuck Colson at 1 in the morning. And by the Constitution, he's got to be taking this oath at noon the next day. And he's drinking, he's talking to him, he reads him part of this inaugural and then tells him why he's doing what he's doing to explain it. It's fascinating. It's almost an hour-long talk. It's not until 2 o'clock that they end the long call between them. And you can sit there and listen to it as if you're talking to them on the phone. The quality is unbelievable. So that's really important, and I'll get to that in a second. And as I say, Roe v. Wade, we're going to talk about that today and how that has changed our national politics. And then, of course, Lyndon Johnson dies on that same day. So this is one of history's great turning points that nobody's ever really noticed before. But it really is this, some historians write about this simultaneity, great things happening all at once. My roadmap for this book was April 1865, if any of you have read that. Great book, Jay Winnick wrote it, but it's about the same thing. And he uses this term, simultaneity. You know, Lincoln assassinated, end of the war, all these things happening at once that caused these sharp turning points in our history. And then this, of course, is kind of the overview of what we'll get to, but this is kind of the ending of the New Deal. The Great Society stopped. Civil rights movement stalls. The Nixon counter-revolution in full bore. It leads to the Reagan, everybody talks about the Reagan Revolution. It's really the Nixon counter-revolution. Reagan puts a smiling face on it, but this is where it starts, and this is the beginning of it. Roe v. Wade will then supercharge this confrontational politics that Nixon starts, so that people are already separated, and the extreme people will go to the extremes of their parties and begin this movement that, you know, on one side becomes the Tea Party, and on the other side is the extreme left of the Democratic Party. It is the month that gives us no compromise. It's why we are living today with a federal government in which the idea of no compromise becomes a political strategy. It's why we talk about government shutdowns today. It starts with abortion, where people won't compromise about that issue, and it gets into our bloodstream and begins to work its way through, so that today, as I'll show you, a big part of the Tea Party is evangelicals, huge part of the Tea Party. So there's a direct line between all of this. So how we get here? Before I get to Roe v. Wade, let's talk about the Nixon counter-revolution. Look at this, stuns me every time I show this. This is 1964. This is the second greatest landslide in presidential history. The first being what? Anybody know what the first is? It's 1936, FDR. Yeah. Yeah. In Landon. Exactly. Alf Landon. Exactly. Yeah. This is, and the reason the South is starting to move there is, you know why? The 64 Civil Rights Act that we just celebrated, you know, the anniversary of last year. And of course, Barry Goldwater, Arizona. By the way, John Dean was great friends with Barry Goldwater's son, Barry Goldwater Jr., who I've met several times, and a great guy. But this is a great landslide. And the Democratic Party, it's the FDR coalition that he put together that is at its high point here in terms of, the Democratic Party is almost twice the size of the Republican Party when this happens in '68. Now, you see the difference here? This is Nixon winning. And the reason for this change is one thing. It's the Vietnam War and all the chaos that comes out of it. Secondarily, the civil rights movement and the backlash against that. But you see here, George Wallace took the Deep South, those same states that you saw before, adding Arkansas. The rest of it's Nixon, and Humphrey wins, obviously, the blue states. But look at this, 4 years later. That's Nixon's landslide in '72. Now, I'll tell you a couple things about this. You know, obviously only Massachusetts votes for McGovern. This, again, is Vietnam. People did not want to just walk out of Vietnam after losing 50,000 lives. It's kind of appropriate we talk today on Armistice Day about this. But that's really what happens. I mean, Nixon cleans up. But he also cleans up because he has figured out how to create a new coalition that will then become the Reagan coalition. And it's made up of a lot of different things, but it clearly is, you know, this backlash to the chaos of the 60s. Civil rights movement, crime, the war, the protesting, that's Kent State, not too far from here. And this, the next day after he's elected in 72, Nixon is talking to one of his advisors, and he puts it this way. These are the issues, he said, that elected him by a landslide. Busing, amnesty, acid, and welfare. Those are the things. Now, for a long time in our history, national politics were decided based on economics and prosperity and order. Now we're going to switch over to the change that we live in today, which is the social issue becomes the prominent issue in national politics. Busing is civil rights. That's a code, obviously, for civil rights. Amnesty is patriotism in the Vietnam War and kidlash, as they called it. You know, the spoiled kids on the campuses who are protesting. Acid is promiscuity. It's both the sexual revolution and the drug revolution from the 60s, resulting mainly from Vietnam and the chaos, and also, obviously, rock and roll and drugs and all that stuff. And then welfare, you come back to that. Again, the prominence of the race issue in national politics has always been overwhelming. So you have race at the beginning and at the end, but it's not just race, it's big government versus little government. So what Nixon is doing is, there's some scholars who wrote about it, creating a new majority. And he's going to take the people who are disaffected by all of these things, particularly the people in the South, particularly about patriotism in the South, but also race, obviously. And he's going to move them from solidly Democratic over to Republican. So that's why we got this huge change that we've been living with that starts at this time. This is a great picture to kind of emphasize the party realignment and the polarization based on social issues. This is January 1, 1973. That's Ronald Reagan with, do you know who that is? Jack Gilligan, who is Ohio's governor. Ohio State was playing USC in the Rose Bowl. That's what that picture is. But it's a great photograph of, to me, encapsulates what's really going to be happening out of this month. The Reagan Revolution will rise out of this. And another way to look at this is Nixon in his second inaugural. Look at what he says. You didn't notice it at the time. People don't write about this very much. But if you go back and read it and then listen to his phone call the night before, he says, in our lives, let each of us ask not just what government can do for me, but what can I do for myself? So do you see what he's echoing? Yeah, he's echoing this. Ask not. But what is the ask not he says? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That collective FDR New Deal idea. This is the beginning of the me generation. Self-reliance. What can I do for myself? We will support those who will support themselves. You know, and it's really the beginning of all this stuff. So that's the Reagan Revolution beginning with the Nixon counter-revolution. Now, what does Roe do to all this? As I say, Roe supercharges this. And so it's important to understand Roe, and especially today, you know, here we are 40 years later, and we've got threats to shut down the government, no compromise, over Planned Parenthood. And it is no coincidence that we're still arguing about this 40 years later. And I'm going to tell you the story of how Roe was decided, not because I have an answer to this, because I don't. And I tried to write this as neutrally as I could, because people feel very strongly. If I ask you all, and I'm not going to do it to embarrass you, who feels strongly about abortion in this room, everyone would raise their hands. Then I would ask you who would compromise their position, and maybe one person would raise their hands. It really does tell you something. So this is a pivotal core issue that's still in our national politics. This is the court that decided Roe. And to introduce the players, The guy who's the most important in Roe v. Wade has never been acknowledged until this book, because I tell the inside story of what happened. Lewis Powell. He's critical to what happens in Roe, and I'll tell you how. Next to him is Thurgood Marshall, who Johnson put on the court, an established liberal. Harry Blackmun's the next guy over, who is the author of Roe v. Wade and who everybody associates with Roe v. Wade. He's not the guy who came up with the standard that was put into Roe v. Wade. Powell did. And in particular, Powell's law clerk did, who interviewed with me, and I'm the only person he's ever talked to. So that's a major part of this book. Next to him, you know the guy at the end? That's Rehnquist when he first got on the court. Great stories about how these guys got on the court. Potter Stewart down here from Cincinnati, kind of a centrist, more conservative. William O. Douglas, FDR appointee, very liberal, established liberal on the court, part of the Warren Court. Berger, who Nixon appoints, who is to bring about to undo the Warren Court. Next to him is Brennan, who is a Roman Catholic, but is an established liberal. And all the way at the end is White, Whizzer White, who was appointed by JFK, who is very conservative. And at the end of the day of this court, I'll tell you, at the end of the day, it was 5-2, and the two who voted against it were Whizzer White and who else did? Rehnquist, the two on the end down there. The rest of them voted for it, including, you'll notice, 3 of the Nixon appointees. Berger himself voted and then regretted it and changed his mind. Blackmun is the author of it, and Powell, who Nixon also put on the court. So that's your court that decided this. This is my source. This is Larry Hammond, who now lives in Phoenix, Arizona, and he came to see one of our Watergate programs that John Dean and I did, because when he left the Supreme Court, he started working for the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, listening to Nixon tapes with Leon Jaworski and that whole thing. Another one of these bizarre interconnections of this story. But he agreed to talk to me. So we had some long interviews about how was this really decided. And serendipity plays a huge role in Roe v. Wade. This guy, Hammond, as a young guy coming out of the University of Texas, again, Texas has this connection to all of this stuff. The woman who will argue Roe v. Wade, Sarah Weddington, is one of his classmates at the University of Texas Law School. So he will get on the Supreme Court. How does he get there? Well, he's very smart, but he gets a job on a Court of Appeals in the Washington District. He's there, the judge likes him, great guy, but he's got one issue. He stutters badly. He figured out, though, when he was a kid, that if he took a foreign language, he was really interested in Russia because of Sputnik and the Bay of Pigs and so forth. If he took Russian, he did not stutter in the foreign language. So he ends up going to New Mexico, then back to Texas, and then goes to law school. But when he is at the end of his first year clerkship in the lower court, his judge calls Hugo Black on the Supreme Court and says, I've got a really good clerk, would you like to have him? And Black says, tell me a little bit about him. He says, well, great guy, but he's got this stuttering problem. And Hugo Black says, send him over. And so Larry goes over to meet with him. And he tells me this, that he walks in and he notices on Black's bookshelf, there are 4 books on stuttering and the psychology of stuttering and so forth. And he was told later that nothing gets into that bookshelf unless Black had really digested it and read it. His idea of getting a law clerk at this point in his career was to help somebody else. So he was interested in Larry because of his stuttering issue and hires him. A month later, he dies. So he's out of luck. I mean, Larry didn't really get to do anything. He was there for a month. At the end of the term, normally you just leave. If your justice dies, you get to play out the term, which would have been through the end of the year. But instead, when Nixon picks Powell and Rehnquist at the same time, Powell decides to keep Larry Hammond. So serendipity number 1 is how he gets on the court. Serendipity number 2 is Powell keeping him. And then Powell will keep him for 2 years, the only clerk he ever did that with. But he starts off with him. Powell is a very conservative guy from Richmond, Virginia. Nixon puts him on the court because he's a real law and order guy. He said a lot of negative things about Martin Luther King Jr. Just a guy who you would not expect to be the principal guy behind Roe versus Wade. And of course, Rehnquist is Rehnquist. Both of them were picked in a very unusual way. I don't have enough time to talk about it, but you can read about it in the book. So this is Sarah Weddington. She's 26 years old when she argues in the Supreme Court of the United States, Roe versus Wade. She took on Roe and represented her straight out of law school. She had never been in any other court, so she argues in the district court before Sarah Hughes, and then later in the Supreme Court. Those are the only two times she had been in a courtroom. And her arguments, if you want to hear it, is online. There's a thing called Oh Yes, and you can actually hear the arguments. She does a fair job. She doesn't do a great job. The other side doesn't do a great job. It's not a very well argued case. And you can see this is 1213. It's 1971. So the first argument, the first oral argument, is in December of 1971. And at this point, Powell and Rehnquist are not on the court. So it's being heard by this 7-man court to make a decision. And they can decide to decide a case based on 7, even though these other 2 had been put on the court, but they didn't come onto the court until after the oral argument. So they're not allowed to participate in the decision unless they participate in an oral argument. So they're not going to be involved in what happens is this guy is assigned the task of deciding Roe versus Wade and its companion case out of Georgia, Harry Blackmun. The reason that, if you look at both Berger in the middle and Blackmun, boyhood friends, grew up in Minneapolis. When Nixon could not get 2 Southerners on the court, if you remember Hainsworth and Carswell, and the Senate said no to both of them. They were Southerners. It was part of the Nixon Southern strategy. He gets angry, walks into the press room and says, I guess I can't pick anybody from the South, so I'm going to pick somebody from the North. Within 24 hours, he picks Harry Blackmun. Knows nothing about him, no vetting. This is the guy who will decide one of the most important cases in history. And that's how quickly and impetuously Nixon decides to pick him. And it's because Berger is friends with him. Actually, I think Berger was Blackmun's best man, or the other way around, in their wedding. They were known as the Minnesota Twins, but this case will split them because eventually Berger will drift and regret what he did in Roe, and Blackmun will go the opposite way, and their friendship will totally break apart as a result of this. But nevertheless, he's assigned. Another reason that Berger assigns it to him is that Blackmun, for 10 years, had been general counsel to the Mayo Clinic. So he knows medicine. He's really interested in medicine. If you read Roe v. Wade, you will see that the emphasis is more on the doctor's rights than the woman's rights. It's more about a doctor's decision with his or her patient than it is about the woman's reproductive rights. So he comes up with that. Now, here's what's critical in this whole thing. He starts to study and becomes very interested because he talks with all the docs. Classically, the doctors separate a pregnancy into the trimesters, the first trimester, the first 3 months, and the second 3 months. And that will become the core of Roe v. Wade, this trimester idea. But the first draft, before these other 2 get involved, that is Powell and Rehnquist, is this. Now watch closely what happens. He says, first of all, is there a woman's right to abort? The answer is yes. It's a right of privacy under the 14th Amendment. Under no person can be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Emphasis on liberty. That's the same standard that was used in the same-sex marriage cases, that liberty. What is the liberty we all have? To be free of government interference with personal decisions, right of privacy. A case called Griswold, which was on contraceptives, that Douglas decided was the basis. So no question, there's a right. But, so you have a constitutional right. To overcome such a right, the state would have to put forward what's called a compelling interest to counter it. And that's a really difficult standard. Strict scrutiny that is applied, really difficult to show that. It takes a ton. So what they decide is there is a right, but they decide the pregnant woman cannot be isolated in her privacy. There's something else involved. The heart of the matter, and this is what Blackmun wrote originally, is that somewhere, either forthwith or at conception, or at quickening, which is when life can be in movement, or at birth, or at some point in between, another being becomes involved. So he says, and this is the critical point, it is not for us, the judiciary, especially at this point in development of man's knowledge, to speculate or specify when life begins. Now this will change, but had this come down as it's written, it would have sent it back to the legislatures to say, when does life begin? Not a court deciding it. Okay, so one of the fundamental disagreements people have with this decision is, a lot of people think this is where it should have ended. And in point of fact, there's no line drawn here. They don't say when a state can or cannot allow a woman to not abort, when you can worry about fetal life. So what happens is, we know those guys are not on the court. These guys, the people who I've circled, all said check, I agree with that first draft. So it should have come down. Roe v. Wade should have come down totally differently from how it came down. Radically changed our federal government, in my view. But you've got the classic liberals, you've got Marshall, you've got Douglas, and you've got Brennan. And then you've got these other guys who are considered conservatives, Blackmun and Potter Stewart. And so what happens is, Douglas says it should come down. We voted, it should come down. He wrote a dissent that was never published. And then Berger asked for re-argument. Why? He wants to get these two guys involved because he doesn't even like the idea of recognizing the right. So he's thinking these two would vote against it and maybe influence Blackmun and maybe Stewart to go the other way. This totally backfires on the chief because here's what happens. So now you've got these guys getting involved and you're going to have a full court making a decision. But enter my source, Larry Hammond. So this is another picture of Larry at a younger time. He's the law clerk. What Powell says to him, this is June of 1972, that those decisions should have come down. June of 72. That dissent that was written by William O. Douglas that never got published was published 2 days before the Watergate break-in. So, I mean, these stories are unbelievably connected. It's quite eerie. But what Powell says to Hammond is, go study up. Go read all this stuff. And I can tell you that Roe v. Wade was decided after 2 hours of oral argument in the court. There was no trial. Nobody appeared as a witness. Everything was done by affidavit. No doctors appeared. No experts appeared. It was simply Roe's affidavit about her pregnancy and a doctor's affidavit. And then there were amicus briefs that were filed. But that's it. There was nothing beyond that. A very sparse record. And what Hammond studies is all what we call the amicus briefs, which are friend of the courts, you know, the American Medical Association and other people who weighed in on this. He said he spent the summer reading all that stuff, wrote a 30-page memo, which nobody can find today. He remembers distinctly writing it, and he told me he did. Gave it to Powell, and when he came back, they went to lunch at the end of the summer. The court goes on its vacation. And when they came back, they went to lunch at the Oracle, which is a restaurant not too far from the Supreme Court, still there today. And Powell surprises the heck out of Hammond by saying, I think there is a right of privacy here, and I'm going to vote for it. So Hammond is pleased but surprised. Then this most important thing happens. He does what's called a bench memo before that re-argument for the justice. And as I say, that compelling interest in protecting fetal life is an issue that they're looking at. And if the statute sought to protect the lives of fetuses which could survive outside the uterus, that could survive constitutional challenge, Hammond writes to him. This is where viability comes from. It comes from Hammond writing it based on a lower court case that he had found. And he says, and I'm reading from his memo that I've got a copy of, he says, here the most compelling state interest is in preserving the life of the unborn. From that point, you might reason, as Judge Newman, in the case he's relying on, does, that the state interest becomes more dominant when the fetus is capable of independent existence or becomes viable. So that is where this concept comes from, and it comes through Larry Hammond through Powell. So what happens? We have re-argument in October. Again, Sarah Weddington comes and they re-argue the case. Guess what? Nobody mentions the word viability. Nobody has argued viability. Nobody has argued any point in a pregnancy where the state's interest in protecting fetal life becomes compelling. Nobody has argued that. All they've argued is the right, and that's all the Supreme Court had to decide at that point. They didn't need to do this, but they wanted to settle this for all time, is what Larry told me. They wanted to finish this in a way that would calm the issue and settle it. So after this, Blackmun comes out with his second draft, and his second draft draws the line after 3 months. In other words, a state cannot prevent a woman from having an abortion before 3 months if she and her doctor agree on this, but afterward, a state could if they wanted to. That's what Blackmun thought. He sent that around. Hammond read that and said it really should be viability. So Powell then suggests, and I have the memos, suggests to Blackmun, why don't you think about viability? Why? What's the reasoning for this? There are two reasons for it. And this is where we'll get a little bit legal, but I don't think it's hard. None of this is hard to follow in my view. The first is that a compelling interest, they say, based on this lower court case, is something that everyone agrees to. This is the Supreme Court calling right now. So a compelling interest, and so what the court writes is, who knows when life begins? We don't know. People disagree. Some people think it's at conception. Some people think it's later. Some people think it's not till birth. I think, there are all these in-betweens. We don't know. But, and this is how they get to viability in this lower court case. But the state has proposed that what happens when there's an abortion late enough in a pregnancy that the fetus survives? And they said, well, if that's the case, everyone would agree you would not kill that fetus if it survived. That's how you get to viability. That's the actual, because everyone can agree on it, it becomes compelling. Everyone agrees on it, that's the point. The other thing is, and where Larry Hammond kind of puts his signature on this behind the scenes is, he says, look, if we do what is suggested by Justice Blackmun after the first 3 months, that's not going to help some of the women who need to have an abortion the most, who are most in need of this right. The young, the inexperienced, the poor, the afraid, people who are afraid to tell their boyfriends, husbands, fathers, mothers, not experienced in being pregnant, don't even know they're pregnant, are poor, don't have the ability to get access. Those people, Larry says, the right will pass them by before they have the right. So he suggests taking it, as Powell suggests, all the way out to after the second trimester, which is at the end of 6 months. And this, no matter what you think about the right and about Roe v. Wade, this is one of the reasons that it causes the firestorm, because 6 months in is pretty late into a pregnancy. To say, prior to that time, you, the state, cannot regulate abortion. In the second trimester, you can regulate it for the health of the woman, but not on the right of the fetus. It's only after the second trimester that you can regulate abortion based on fetal rights. That is still the law today. That viability standard still stands. And the rest of the trimester stuff has kind of gone by the wayside in various famous cases that were decided by the court. But that causes the firestorm in a lot of different ways. Late in the pregnancy, a court deciding it, etc. There's one comment, let me read to you what one commentator has written about this. See what you think. This commentator wrote, the court's description of the place of Roe in social history of the United States is unrecognizable. Not only did Roe not, as the court suggests, resolve the deeply divisive issue of abortion, it did more than anything else to nourish it by elevating it to the national level where it is infinitely more difficult to resolve. National politics were not plagued by abortion protests, national abortion lobbying, or abortion marches on Congress before Roe v. Wade was decided. Profound disagreement existed among our citizens over the issue, as it does over other issues such as the death penalty. But that disagreement was being worked out at a state level. As with many other issues, the division of sentiment within each state was not as closely balanced as it was among the population of the nation as a whole, meaning not only that more people would be satisfied with the result of a state-by-state resolution, but also that result would be more stable. Pre-Roe, moreover, political compromise was possible. Who do you think that was written by? Justice Scalia in one of his dissents. So his point, and I don't agree with most things that Scalia writes, and I don't agree with how he handles this, but his point is, I think, logically correct that this issue, by the way it was handled, caused this problem. Sarah Weddington, in fact, got this telegram. You see it's January 22, that's the same day LBJ will die. A little closer look at it. I loved it that it was sent collect. She had to pay for it. Judgment affirmed, and she looked at this telegram, and she's written this, and she had no idea when she read the case where viability came from. She had not argued it. She wondered where it came from. She didn't know until 30 years later when the Powell papers came out how this happened, and if she's read my book, the real story behind the whole thing. Of course, later that day, LBJ dies, as I've said, but this is what happens. The religious right becomes important in our national politics as real. Now, it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like that year or the next year or the next year. It was like several years later, and the religious right had already coalesced around that Bob Jones University and a decision about segregation and so forth. And they decided that even though that activated them, that was, racial prejudice was not a good thing to rally around. Abortion was, like they consider themselves the abolitionists of the current century. But Jerry Falwell, obviously, this becomes, when it does become the issue, it becomes the issue that galvanizes national politics, and it is a no compromise issue that enters our political bloodstream. So you see these debates every year.
It didn't manifest itself until around 1980.
Until 1980 and the Reagan years, and then you saw, of course, every Supreme Court justice being asked their view on abortion. It became the litmus test then. But yeah, it was all that period of time that it took to matriculate through everything and then become the issue that changed everything. And if you look at, there's several books, very good books written about the Tea Party and the rise of the Tea Party in 2010, but over 50% of Tea Party people identify with the evangelical movement, and a huge group of them are anti-abortion. That's a huge issue for them, in addition to being fiscally responsible, which is what they claim is their main issue. In fact, I think social issues are driving them as much as anything else. And of course, so today we see this. Today we are dealing with this same issue 40 years later. And what does it all mean? Where does it all go? I don't know, but I think that understanding how this case was decided is a first step in us having more of a dialogue about it. I had never thought much about abortion. I grew up a Catholic. I was for Roe v. Wade when it came out. Today I would say I'm anti-abortion but pro-choice. In other words, I don't like abortion, but I think it's somebody's decision to make. But at the end of the day, all of us as citizens have to really understand this and think about this issue more than the screaming that's going on about when does that other interest become compelling? What do we really think about it? If you sit and think about it a lot, it's a very difficult, I think it's the most difficult issue we face, period, in national politics. And I also think it has a lot to do with our dysfunction in our national politics. So the summary of this book that I've written, and I've focused on Roe, is, really this is the beginning of the end of the New Deal. Obviously, we still have a lot of the New Deal around Social Security, et cetera. But at the end of the Great Society in a lot of ways. The war on poverty, I don't know if you all remember this. I certainly do. In the 60s, Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty, and I really believed we were going to beat poverty. That war on poverty became culture wars during Nixon years. It's now worrying about same-sex marriage, abortion, all these social issues that have driven national politics. Started the Reagan Revolution. Me generation gets its voice. obviously Wall Street, roaring Wall Street, religion becomes a factor in political life, no compromise enters the political bloodstream. What I say is Nixon lost the battle but won the war. We're today living, I think, in the Nixon counter-revolution, the shadow of it, and the Roe supercharging of all of that. So with that, I think we've got about 10 more minutes here for a Q&A, and if I've offended anybody, I apologize. It's a really difficult topic to talk about, and I've thought a lot about it, and I tried to be as neutral as I can. Larry Hammond, who I consider to be someone who's very liberal, who's my source, wrote me a beautiful letter saying he thought I had got it exactly right. It was well done. He was worried about how I was going to handle it. But he gave me a wonderful letter. I've got a website if you want to read it. It's up on the website, January1973.com. And then just last week, the Catholic Courier came out and said I wrote the most unbiased account of Roe v. Wade that has ever been written. So if I've got those extremes saying it's unbiased, I think I've hopefully written in that way. It's difficult. But in any event, why don't we open it up for comments? Not just questions to me, but people free to comment on what you think about the issue and so forth. So let me start back here first. Yeah.
Help me understand as you talk about the me generation, because I didn't get that out of Nixon's comment at all. What I got out of Nixon's comment was quite the opposite. It was sort of, you can't rely, perhaps we shouldn't be relying on the government for everything. Perhaps we should be looking to ourselves, taking care of ourselves, our family, and whatnot. I don't see that as a me generation. Believe there's a lot of me generation things I could allude to,
yeah,
but I don't see it in Nixon's statement, which is the one you chose to identify.
Yeah, well, there is this, after that period of time, there was this term that people used as a shorthand called the me generation. And if you read his entire inaugural, what he is saying, which is so different from the New Deal and from the Great Society, he's trying to stop all of that stuff, is we will help those who help themselves. We will take care of those who take care of themselves. And somebody from the New Deal side would say, well, there are people who still need help. And it's not just about you, and it's not just about, in the American people, just about me. So that's why I say that. It's to contrast it with the movement that we had through the FDR time and the great coalition that was built, and how it then radically changed in this month and move forward. But your point's a good point. I mean, I was saying to Polly beforehand that it's really difficult to write about Nixon because he's such a villain in so many ways. But in so many ways, there's good stuff. For example, when he finishes, when Henry Kissinger calls him from Paris to say, we've done it, we've ended this war. Now think about this. Nixon didn't start that war. He's ending a war that LBJ started. He's drawing down. He's taking all this flack for doing so. He ends it with what he thinks will be peace with honor. It's not at all. But still, this is a good thing that he did for this country that he's not given credit for. But he takes that call. The first person he calls is Pat Nixon. And their phone call, for some reason, got through all these filters of no personal calls. And she says, oh, Dick, that is so wonderful. You can tell those two have a great relationship. And so he's great with her. In public, he wouldn't touch her, wouldn't kiss her, nothing. But the first person he calls is her. And his daughters are on these phone calls. A lot of them seep through too. Julie and Tricia, particularly Julie, who's so much like him. And they're beautiful phone calls. She calls him daddy, and they talk about who they're going to invite to the inaugural ball, and she's worried about Eleanor Roosevelt's first cousin, a woman who was Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, very Princess Alice Roosevelt Longworth was her name. She was a good friend of the Nixon family, but she was sick in January of '73, and Julie was worried about her, wanted to leave a chair on the inaugural stand with a rose on it for her, in her honor. Two of them talked about that. It's just a wonderful relationship, obviously, that he has with his family. So he is a villain in so many ways, but he's a real mixed bag. And it's hard to write about him in a way that people don't come away saying, oh my God, it's unbelievable, because a lot of it is unbelievable. I tried to be neutral, but I'm sure I wasn't with him. Yes, sir.
On the subject of Watergate, why did they do it?
On the subject of Watergate, why did they do it? Well, since I've been running around the country with John Dean, I have a real good idea about that. What happens is Gordon Liddy is, and this is an interesting story because Gordon Liddy gets into the White House in the summer of '71, the day after Tricia Nixon is married in the White House. The New York Times has on its front page a picture of Nixon with her in the Rose Garden. Right next to it, the Pentagon Papers. The very day. And so because, this is Daniel Ellsberg, he's the original WikiLeaks guy and all that stuff. Ellsberg released that. Nixon initially doesn't care because, again, it's about Johnson and even Kennedy's problems, not his. But they're worried, and what he's worried about is, again, this is a Nixon, good or bad, he's worried because he's negotiating with China to open China, that if we can't keep our secrets, they won't negotiate with us. Same with the North Vietnamese. He's trying to end the war. They think we can't keep our secret, everything's going to be published in the paper the next day. So he worries about leaks. He creates a group called the Plumbers within the White House because he doesn't trust, at that point, J. Edgar Hoover, who's elderly and really, they fight about all sorts of things. But he doesn't trust him to go after Ellsberg the way he wants to go after Ellsberg. So he brings in Gordon Liddy, who's a complete nut. But he's a lawyer, he's a former prosecutor, he worked at the Treasury Department. I mean, he had chops, but he's a nut, and as you and I have talked about. By the way, his license plate is H2O Gate, right? Watergate. So if you ever see him, you'll know that's him. Gordon Liddy has that same license plate. They're the only two people who have it. But so they're upset. So he brings in Liddy. Liddy brings in a guy named Hunt, Howard Hunt, who is good friends with Chuck Colson. Actually, it's Colson who recommends him. If you remember Chuck Colson, the guy who becomes the prison fellowship guy. The two of them went to Brown at different times, but they were in a Brown Alumni Association. Howard Hunt is longtime CIA, involved in the Bay of Pigs. Hunt brings in Miamians who are anti-Castro people. So they are anti-McGovern, anti-Democrats, because they think they're going to, God help us, recognize Cuba. And so they are very pro-Nixon, very anti-McGovern, and it's easy to get these guys, activated. And they're all Bay of Pigs veterans, who Howard Hunt had been involved in the Bay of Pigs with fascinating stuff. Let me just finish this point. And so they come into the White House, they create the Plumbers and the executive, that beautiful building next to the White House, that big building. They were in the basement, room 16, special investigative unit. They put a funny sign outside of it because one of their guys told a grandmother, "What do you do?" And he says, "I'm trying to stop leaks at the White House." "Oh, you're a plumber." So that's how they get that name. They took the sign down quickly because nobody thought it was very funny. And they then, in September, now think about this, Watergate's not until June of '72, September of '71, they fly out to Los Angeles and break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try and find some dope on him, to discredit him. And they don't find anything, but they rough up the place and they come back. It's approved within the White House, that operation. John Ehrlichman, the top domestic advisor for Nixon, approves it in writing. And it's the reason he'll go to jail, is the Ellsberg break-in. But that happens in September of 1971. At the end of that year, the guys in the White House want to get Liddy out. So idiotically, they send him over to the committee to re-elect the president at the end of the year to work for Jeb Magruder, who's very young, very inexperienced, and then a very distracted John Mitchell, who leaves the Attorney General's office to go back and run the campaign. He had run it in '68. He goes back to run it, and the reason that he's so distracted, his wife, Martha Mitchell, is Looney Tunes, threatening to kill herself. They live at the Watergate, of all places, jumping off the balcony at the Watergate. So he's not paying attention, Mitchell isn't, and they approved the plan for Liddy to go in and get dirt. What they want to do is find out whether or not there's money from pro-North Vietnam or pro-Castro that's coming through the Democrats. So they target Larry O'Brien's office, who you all know Larry O'Brien because of the NBA and the Larry O'Brien Trophy. Prior to that, he ran the Democratic Party, and he was the chair that year. They wanted to get in there and get those documents, and they also wanted to establish a tap on his line. So that's why they went in there, was to, it was Liddy's idea to go in there and do all this stuff, and it obviously, they went in one time, put the bugs in the wrong place, and they got caught the second time, going back in a second time. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's an unbelievable story, but that literally happened. The second time happens 2 days after Douglas pens his dissent that no one will ever see in Roe v. Wade. So that's why they went in. You were going to say something in the middle of that?
When you bring up how they brought in the Miamians, on the smoking gun, Nixon makes reference to the Bay of Pigs thing.
Yes.
Do you ever discuss that with John Dean, what directly he was referring to?
Yeah, we actually do a whole 3-hour program on that smoking gun tape. The smoking gun tape is at the end of the first week after the break-in. Nixon is talking with Haldeman, and John Dean has actually talked with Haldeman right before he walks in. And Haldeman's notes are in existence, and Dean, was said to him, there's this thing between the CIA and the FBI that if they start to run into each other's business, they call it a delimitation agreement, that they'll stop investigating so they don't uncover some CIA assets as a result of this inadvertently. And some of the money that had already been traced had gone through Mexico, and they were worried that there was a CIA connection to it. Howard Hunt was also CIA, as were all of these Bay of Pigs guys. One of them who was still in the CIA when he did the Watergate operation. So what Nixon's referring to is Howard Hunt, and he says, Dean recommends, as John Mitchell recommended to him the night before, why don't you tell the director of the FBI, a guy named Pat Gray, to turn off the investigation because you're going to run into Bay of Pigs and to all this stuff that they don't, So have the CIA go over and ask them under this delimitation agreement to stop the investigation. That becomes the smoking gun tape.
Is this obstructing justice?
Because it's obstructing justice and it's saying stop the investigation. But that's what it's from, and that's what Nixon is referencing when he references Bay of Pigs. It's fascinating. I mean, unbelievable. Yes.
Just wanted to
Gotta have the microphone.
just wanted to compliment you on the book. I'm a big avid reader of history, and I read your book, and it was very entertaining and very interesting. And
And everyone should buy a copy before they
I highly recommend it. And part of the reason is that that April 1865 book that you talked about is a very similar attempt, although in that book, I don't think you had as many variables.
And the interconnections,
Maybe you could just talk a little bit about the task that you had to write this book, because not only do you have telling the story of the events as they happen, but you also do a really good job of giving the background of each of the topics. And then I imagine you have a lot more data and material. So how do you comb through all that to keep it very interesting and not be too much of a data overload? But which you did a very excellent job of.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So I am totally fascinated in history with this idea of things being connected. My very first book is called Linking Rings, because my great-grandfather was a magician and linking, but I meant it in the sense that things are linked that you don't normally see linked until you look back. It's this aspen analogy. You would not expect these things to be linked together. For example, and I say this in the introduction, in the First World War, Woodrow Wilson's wife dies in August of 1914, days after general war breaks out in Europe. As a result of just that happening, he's in grief for almost 6 months and doesn't take as much an active role in stopping that war that people thought he should. I mean, he was just devastated by that. And it also opens up, what happens is he ends up, Edith Bowling Gault is who he marries. He marries within like a year and a half of that. To her, and she kind of stokes his messianic view of himself. And they go to Paris together. He doesn't take anybody with him, and he agrees to all these reparations against Germany, which arguably lead to the Second World War. So I'm fascinated by these connections and these little things that happen, these contingency moments in history. And if you look at American history, and I don't know if it's true in world history, things kind of flatline, and then all of a sudden, all this stuff happens at once, and then it goes back, and then all this stuff happens at once, and it's all kind of connected. So it fascinates me. In this instance, I knew that there were these 6 big stories to tell, and I knew that I had to kind of interweave them together. I had no idea they were so connected until I started writing it, which is why I think people think it's a fun read, because I'm having as much fun writing it as people are reading it. You know, it's like, wow, look at that. Isn't that something? And just on sources, I'll briefly tell you that the Nixon tapes are online. You can go to the Nixon library, pull down White House tapes, go to the January of 1973. And if you know how to use them, which I do, you can find the tape and listen to it in your study here in Cleveland. It's fascinating. So there's a lot of stuff that I was able to do that would have taken me 10 years to do in the past, and a lot of travel, a lot of stuff online, the archives for the end of the Vietnam War, the transcript for the Watergate Burglars trial, a lot of stuff online. And the New York Times is online, and you could go and look any day and read the whole paper. And that was a big source. If you look at my footnotes, I quote that a lot. A couple more questions, and I think we'll wrap it up. But one back there and then one up here.
Nixon's secretary burn a lot of the tapes, or
no?
Misremembering.
No, the question is, didn't Nixon's secretary burn a lot of the tapes? You're thinking of Florence Harding, who burned a lot of his stuff. No, I'm joking. There's a thing called the 18.5-minute gap, which is on one of the tapes that the allegation is that Rosemary Woods accidentally erased it when she was doing the famous Rosemary Lean. She was answering the phone and she had her foot on a pedal that erased it. That didn't happen. And I wrote a long piece about that. I was on CBS This Morning 2 years ago on it. If you want to look it up online, just put my name in and the 18.5-minute gap. It's a long explanation about why that didn't happen and why Rosemary Woods could not have done that. So who did? But it did happen. It was 18.5 minutes, and it was if the break-in was on a Saturday early in the morning, this tape that is erased is on the Tuesday after that. When Nixon comes back to the White House, he was in Florida, and it's his first day back in the White House, and there's 18.5 minutes of his conversation with Bob Haldeman that's been erased. And if you look at it, the experts say it was erased 9 times. Somebody went over it 9 different times. So it wasn't her doing it. And so the question is, who did it? And I think I answer it in this one piece, but in any event. Okay, last question.
Yeah, you said something about confrontational politics, and you studied Reagan. But Reagan had a wonderful relationship with Tip O'Neill, who was a Democrat and Speaker of the House. And I thought they got along very well together. I thought that the two-party system did work then.
Yeah.
It wasn't until Gingrich that I thought it started to break.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, though, that what Reagan inherited from Nixon was this emphasis on social issues. And again, it's like this abortion did not really activate for a few years. It matriculated through that. What the Reagan years did was to continue this Nixon counter-revolution, which was emphasizing things like social issues. If you go back and read, there's a whole bunch of anti-gay stuff that was written at that time, a whole lot of pro-life abortion stuff that was galvanizing, especially labor, Catholics, people in the South moving over, and Reagan effectively brought them all in. Now, as I say, he put a smiling face on it, and he did have some good relations with Tip O'Neill, as you said. The two of them did get along, but we still had the beginnings of what then will become the Gingrich Contract on America and all that stuff. It all comes out of that stream. So I'm not trying to say it happened overnight. I'm just trying to say this is its genesis and how it percolated through the system. But it's a good point, because people still revere Reagan for lots of good reasons. There are lots of reasons that people revere him that I don't think are good reasons, but that's a political viewpoint of mine. So.
All right, with that, let's Mr. James Robenalt will be here for questions and for signing books afterwards. Please, let's give him a big round of applause.
Thanks for having me, and I hope to come back on the Harding Affair, which is quite a story. I mean, you want a good story.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the adult program series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.